Hi, and welcome back again to The Journey in a new series called The Missing Half. If you've been with us thus far and studied the story of the Bible, we're trying to view our Bible as one book with one introduction, one story, and one conclusion. The story begins in Genesis chapter 12 with a promise to Abram, where he says two basic things. I want to bless you, and I want you to be a blessing to the nations. We follow that top line, bottom line, or upper level, lower level, depending upon if you're studying it overseas or here. We followed that story all the way through the Bible and found that there was a conclusion. In the very end of time, in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, we find that Jesus is worshiped because he redeemed people from every tongue, every tribe, and every nation. So everything between Genesis chapter 12 and Revelation chapter 5, verse 9 is one story. One cohesive theme. Well, as I've traveled around and given this message, I've done it for a very long time, and when I started off, my children were very little. And I love to spend time with my kids. I'm called by God to be a good father, so I'm trying to invest in them. So one time I came back from a trip, and my son Luke, very young, wanted to spend some time with me. I wanted to spend time with him, so I said, Luke, what do you want to do? He said, Dad, I want to watch my favorite Sunday school video. So I said, okay, let's get together. So we got up on the couch. I crossed my legs. He crossed his legs. He wanted to be just like Dad. We put in the video, and out came all these children who began to sing Sunday school songs. And as they began to sing the Sunday school songs, I began to listen to the words very closely. And I found out that all the words to the first song dealt with the top line of the covenant. I thought, this is fine. This is good. My son needs to know that God loves him. This is good. So I waited for the second song. As I waited for the second song, I found out that all the words to the second song dealt with the top line of the covenant. I thought, okay, third song. All the words to the third song dealt with the top line of the covenant. I began to think, what's going on here? So I reached up, grabbed the video sleeve that the video came in. I began to look through all the words to all the songs. I actually looked at all the songs and just simply thought through all the words. And as I thought through all the words, I found out of the 12 songs my son was learning, only 2 had anything to do with the bottom line. And I was being very generous. If it mentioned the word world in it, I gave it bottom line credit. But by far, they were all top line songs. Now, experts in the field of communication tell us that 95% of what gets communicated to us non-verbally. So I began to ask myself the question, what is my son really learning non-verbally through this video series? Well, later I had to go to a conference. I didn't actually have to go. I was invited to a Christian conference and to represent Frontiers, the mission agency that I was with at the time. And so be honest with you, I don't like Christian conferences. I like mission conferences, but not Christian conferences. But they phoned me, they faxed me, they said, you got to look at this. There's going to be 6,000 people coming, a lot of people making lifetime decisions. I thought, okay, maybe I need to go. So I went to my boss, Keith Butler, at the time. I said, Keith, I've looked it all over. I think someone really needs to go. I think I should be the one to do it. So he said, okay, go out and get your tickets. So I went out and bought my tickets for Honolulu, Hawaii. When I arrived in Honolulu, Hawaii, there were 6 main plenary sessions. About 3 speakers, each giving 2 major lessons. And so I sat and listened to every one of their messages. They were excellent. They were right on. They were biblical, but they were all top line. So then I went to the Christian bookstore. I said, ma'am, how many books did you get? They had shipped in 400 to 600 different titles into the church where they were holding this conference. And she says, I don't know, we must have shipped in 400 to 600 different books. So I walked up and down every row, looked at every title of every book. You know what I found out? Out of the 400 to 600 different titles they had shipped in, 14 had anything to do with the bottom line of taking God's glory cross-culturally. All the rest were top-line books. I then went to the optional seminar list. 52 optional seminars that were offered. Read every paragraph about every optional seminar. You know what I found out? Out of the 52 optional seminars they were offering, only 3 had anything to do with taking God's glory cross-culturally to a people of another nation. Now, there's nothing wrong with top-line seminars. I've been to many and been blessed by many. There's nothing wrong with top-line messages or top-line books. My shelves are full of them. But something happens when you get top line after top line after top line after top line, or upper level after upper level after upper level after upper level thrown at you. And that is, you wind up in a very self-centered evangelical Christianity. A Christianity that says all the right do's and doesn't do the don'ts, but inwardly is very focused on itself, its people, its pews, its youth, and is blind to what God is doing around the globe. Let me give you a graphic example of this. Greg Livingstone, the man that I helped start Frontiers with, was asked to speak at a large evangelical church on the East Coast. Now, he was pumped because, number one, it was a large church. Number two, it was going to be televised. Very rarely do you get a large church and be televised and to speak about your heart for the Muslim world. So when he went down, he was tremendously excited. But when he arrived, he found out there had been tremendous miscommunication. Why? He found out he'd not been asked to give the main message. He'd only been asked to give the missions minute. A big letdown from 30 to 1. But very few things stopped this guy, Greg Livingstone. So Greg gets up there and with very little introduction, he says these words. Now, this was back in 1980. If you didn't know what was happening in the United States back in 1980, there was an Iranian hostage crisis situation, which means the Iranians had overtaken our embassy, had taken our people, held them captive down in the basement, and we had a crisis situation on our hands. It was during this hostage crisis situation that Greg Livingstone went and spoke to the church, and he got up and he said these words. How many of you are praying for the 52 Americans held hostage in Iran? 4,000 hands went straight up. He said, wow, that's fantastic. He says, let me ask you another question. Put your hands down. He says, let me ask you another question and be just as honest because Jesus is watching. How many of you are praying for the 42 million Iranians held hostage to Islam? 4 hands slowly went up. He said, what? Only 4 people? What are you guys, Americans first and Christians second? I thought this was a Bible-believing church. And then he sat down. Needless to say, he was never invited back to the church. But he made a point. Can we be Americans first and Christians second? Or Filipinos first and Christians second? Or Brazilians first and Christians second? Can we be so caught up with our nationality that that's a higher priority than our heavenly home? Why is it that today, in North America at least, it's 1 full-time Christian worker for every 200 people, whereas in North Africa, it's roughly 1 missionary for every 500,000 Muslims, and in Northern India, it's roughly 1 missionary for every 2.5 million Muslims. 1 to 200 here versus 1 to 2.5 million in Northern India. Why are we so saturated? Well, I fear it's because we've misunderstood the story of the Bible. We've misunderstood the Abrahamic covenant, and we're reading it incorrectly. And as a result, we're missing half of our Bible. Hence, it's called the missing half. Well, let's look at what we're talking about. If you were to look at the Abrahamic covenant and say the top line of the covenant plus the bottom line of the covenant equals God's promise, or the upper level plus the lower level equals God's promise. Again, we use those interchangeably. Overseas, we use upper level, lower level. In the States, we use top line, bottom line. If the top line or the upper level were represented by the letter A, the bottom line or the lower level were represented by the letter B, and the promise equals C, you'd have a very simple mathematical equation. A plus B equals C. Now, any mathematician can tell you that A and B have 3 relationships to each other. A can be greater than B, meaning God had a higher priority on blessing His people, the Israelites, than He had on blessing the nations. A can be less than B, meaning God's desire to bless the nations was greater than his desire to bless the Israelites. He had a higher priority than the nations. Or A can be equal to B. God had an equal desire to bless the nations as he had to bless his people, the Israelites. Now, if A is greater than B, if the top line or the upper level is greater than the bottom line or the lower level, then what God basically said to Abram was this: look, Abe, buddy, I want to bless your socks off. I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. I want to pour out my grace, my mercy, my love upon you. And Abraham, if some of this blessing happens to spill out to all the nations on the face of the earth, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm God. I can take care of it. But I'm primarily concerned about blessing you. God's desire to bless the Israelites was greater than his desire to bless the nations. Now, there's another possibility. A is less than B. And if the top line were less than the bottom line, then what God said to Abram was this: look, Abe, I want to reach the nations, and I've got to use people to do that, and so I drew lots, and it came to you, so I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll bless you, but I'm primarily concerned that you turn around and be a blessing to the nations, because Abraham, I love them so much, and I want to bless them. God's focus was far greater on blessing the nations than it was on Israel. Now, could that ever be? No, it couldn't. Why? Because there's too much scripture that talks about Israel being the apple of his eye or a royal diadem in the hand of our Lord. So that's not an option. But there is one other option, and that is that A equals B. Now, if A equals B, then what God basically said to Abram was this: look, Abe, buddy, I want to bless you. I want to bless your socks off. I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. I want to pour out my grace, my mercy, my love upon you. And Abraham, just as important, I want you to turn around and be a blessing to all the nations on the face of the earth, because Abraham, I love them just as much as I love you. In other words, God loved the Israelites as much as he loved the Hittites, as much as he loved the Jebusites, as much as he loved the Philistines, as much as he loved the Babylonians, as much as he loved the Assyrians, as much as he loved the Egyptians. God loved all peoples equally. Now you can imagine Abraham sitting there scratching his head saying, God, I don't get it. Is A greater than B or is A equal to B? Which one is it? Well, let's see if we can help Abraham out and determine what it is. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, we read these words: For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Do you see those words? Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth? Gee, does that sound like A is greater than B or A is equal to B? Well, upon first reading, it sounds like A is greater than B. It sounds like God has a greater love, a greater affinity for the Israelites because he chose them out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. Okay, let's go on down a few pages. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 4 and 5. Here, God is giving the rules about tithing to the Levites, the full-time Christian workers back in those days. And in talking about that, he says these words, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 4 and 5. You are to give them the first fruits of your grain, new wine, and oil, and the first wool from the shearing of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. Did you see those words, out of all your tribes? God chose the Levite tribe to minister to all the other 11 tribes. Now let me ask you this question. Did God love the Levite tribe more than he loved the other 11 tribes? Well, the answer should be no. He loved all the tribes equally. Yet he chose the Levites for a specific task, for a specific purpose, and that was to minister to the other tribes. There was equal love, but different roles. Apply that same thinking back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Now, let me ask you this question. Does that necessarily mean that God has a greater love for the Israelites, yes or no? No. It could mean that God has a special purpose for the Israelites. And what is that purpose that He has for the Israelites? To take His glory, to take His gospel, to take that good news to the nations. I want to challenge you that God didn't have a special love or a greater love for the Israelites. God had a special purpose for the Israelites, and God loved all the nations equally. In other words, God loved the Hittites as much as He loved the Israelites. He loved the Philistines as much as He loved the Israelites. He loved the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians as much as He loved the Israelites. God loved all nations equally. What was the purpose that they had? That special purpose was to bless the nations. That was their calling. That's what He wanted them to be. That's why He called them to be priests. You shall be for me a kingdom of priests. Now, we don't really know it, but there are two types of priesthood in the Old Testament. There was a specific priesthood and a general priesthood. Let me explain the difference. The specific priesthood were the Levites ministering to the other 11 tribes. So they were to minister on behalf of the other 11 tribes to God. That was the specific priesthood. But there was the general priesthood. And that is that the Israelites were to be taking His glory to the nations. That as a nation, they were priests, and they were to take God's glory to all the nations. That's why it says in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, these words, "And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." A kingdom of priests. All the nations who were there. Remember, that's why the promised land, the top line, bottom line part of the promised land. The promised land was strategically located in the center of the nations as the nations came through trading. As they went to that great powerhouse Egypt down in the south, they would interact with the Israelites. As they interacted with the Israelites, it was the Israelites' opportunity to sit down and to share with them about their God. God brought all the nations to them through the major trading routes, and that's why they were to be a kingdom of priests. That's why the Gentile court was put in the temple, the largest court that there was, because God wanted to make room for the nations to come and to worship Him. We're here to challenge you. A equals B. Meaning the top line of the covenant is the same as the bottom line of the covenant in order of terms of priority for God. The upper level and the lower level are equal in God's eyes. God's desire to bless the Israelites was just the same as His desire to bless all the nations on the face of the earth. A equals B. I'll be using that terminology the rest of this series. Okay? Now, most Christians, although A is equal to B, are in reality living out an A greater than B life. In other words, they're more focused on God's desire to bless them than they are on God's desire to be a blessing to the nations. They're reading their Bible, only looking for the top line of the covenant, never looking for the bottom line of the covenant.